Catherine Malabou is professor of philosophy at European Graduate School and professor of modern European philosophy at the Center of Research at Kingston University, London. Her doctoral thesis, L'avenir de Hegel, Plasticité, Temporalité, Dialectique, was done in 1996. Her mentor was Jacques Derrida. In her work, she explored feminism and many, many other issues connected to things which are around us. Her book, Pleasure Erase, was translated in Slovene language just a few weeks ago by Maska, and presentation of this was yesterday. With us is also Mladen Dolar, our dear friend, a regular guest at Indigo Festival. He's professor at University of Ljubljana, philosophy, lecturer around Europe, across USA and so on, and very dear, dear friend, and of course one of the founders so-called Ljubljana Lacanian School. So I would like to thank also to the French Institute Air France to help that this project is alive today. Bienvenue à Ljubljana, dobrodošli v Ljubljani, and please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I'll do a brief introduction and some initial thoughts on the question of artificial intelligence that we'll be talking about today. Catherine Malabou, we are really honored. It's a great joy to have you here back in Ljubljana. I think you were here 10 years ago, maybe. It's great that you are back. It's also a personal joy for me. We've been in contact, we've been friends for a very long time. Blaž has already made a brief introduction. Let me just expand on this a bit. Catherine was indeed, for many years, professor at the Center for Research of Modern Philosophy at Kingston, but she now teaches in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of California at Irvine, and at the NYU, New York University, and also at the European Graduate School, where we are actually colleagues, because Slava Alenka and I also teach there. And well, she graduated from École Normale Supérieure de Saint-Cloud and finished her PhD under the supervision of Jacques Derrida. And this became indeed the book that already Blaž mentioned, L'avenir de Hegel, The Future of Hegel. And this book was an event. It was truly a great event, published in '96. She's also the author of some 20 books translated into many languages. And I will just mention some. First, since we'll be talking about artificial intelligence, I have to mention the first one on the brain, que faire de notre cerveau? What should we do with our brain? In 2004, and the one more than 10 years later, Métamorphose de l'intelligence, Metamorphosis of Intelligence, published in 2017. And we'll be coming back to those two titles. There are two books published in Slovene, just published in Slovene, The Ontology of the Accident, Ontologia naključja, and Le plaisir effacé, Izbrisani užitek. But the first Slovene book translation was actually Bodi moje telo, Dialektika dekonstrukcija spol. This was a collection of essays published by Cortina in 2011. I highly recommend all these three books which exist in Slovene. And I should perhaps mention also her collaboration with Judith Butler. She published the book You Be My Body for Me together, and a collaboration with Adrian Johnston for Self and Emotional Life, trying to negotiate the distance between psychoanalysis and neuroscience. And Adrian Johnston, by the way, will be coming next month to Ljubljana. And her last project is Au voleur, Anarchisme Philosophie, the project which deals with anarchism. And there are many other books I want to mention. This is just a brief selection. Now, the first book, as I said, The Future of Hegel, was immediately something that inspired enthusiasm, particularly in Ljubljana. It was very much in resonance with the work pursued in Ljubljana regarding Hegel, but from slightly different angle. And it was actually a defense of Hegel versus against the deconstructionist critique. And this was a PhD done under the supervision of Derrida, the chief deconstructionist. So, chapeau. To do this sort of thing, to go exactly against the grain of the reading of your mentor. And Derrida then wrote also a 50 pages long review response and then preface. It served as a preface to the English version of the book. But it's not only defense of Hegel against the deconstructive reading, also against so many inveterate prejudices about the absolute idealism, the absolute knowing, teleology, the closure, etc., etc. And the very title, The Future of Hegel, actually stands in opposition to this by raising the question of a future in Hegel. And when to cut it short, the key to this new reading of Hegel is the central notion of plasticity, which Malabou took from Hegel as something that, proposed by Hegel, exceeds the Hegelian context and finds its use in areas which can be seemingly very remote from the Hegelian enterprise. And I would say, in Alice in Wonderland, there is a line where Humpty Dumpty says, "If I make a word do a lot of work, I always pay it extra." So, Katrina, I think you owe a fat extra fee to this word plasticity, because you really made it work hard, very hard. It's a kind of then key to get of any kind of deadlock and to supersede the traditional philosophical antinomies and oppositions, but also to the point of the danger of becoming a sort of passepartout, being universally applicable. And I will just say for plasticity that originally in the Hegelian context, it refers to the capacity to give form and to receive form, an intertwined double capacity, which already indicates an operation which goes beyond the hyle morphe, the matter and the form, the Aristotelian couple which presided over the birth of philosophy. And this was only the starting point. The next move, or the really unexpected move, was to move from there to neuroscience. And this is an unexpected move by any traditional standards, for what could be more removed from the usual image of the Hegelian enterprise, its highly abstract, speculative character, than the modern neuroscientific endeavors based on laboratory measurement, experiment, precise observation, the empirical, the embodied. And considering all human capacities of reason and spirit only insofar as they are embodied, embedded in active. But, well, this is an aside, there is already in Hegel a moment what he calls the infinite judgment, a judgment immediately equating two entities that don't have any common measure, incommensurate entities. And the model for this is his sentence, "The spirit is a bone." That is, he looks at this embodiment, immediate embodiment of spirit in the bone, and the deadest thing there is, as a skull. He looks at this equation, and of course, this was a time of phrenology, which was a sort of pseudoscience. But nevertheless, the very idea of phrenology was to look for localization of cognitive capacities in the material in the skull. And Hegel, who didn't subscribe to this at all, but nevertheless regarded this as a very necessary step that the spirit must take in the very impossibility. And perhaps all of Katrine's work can be seen in the light of an elaboration, a further elaboration of the completely different take on the question of an infinite judgment. The infinite judgment of two entities which seemingly have nothing in common, but are nevertheless brought together. And considering the possibility of this bringing together this equation against enormous odds. And, well, her claim was that the plasticity can find the best deployment in neuroplasticity. Not that there is a direct application or equation, but plasticity presents a sort of middle term connecting Hegel and new neurosciences and the whole development, staggering development of neurosciences. And indeed, one of her books is called La Chambre de Milieu, which is kind of connecting room, the connecting room between the two worlds. This is persevering with this infinite judgment is really the source of the great merit and respect and fascination with her work. Considering spirit as always embodied, and this was the blind spot of philosophers who usually thrive on abstraction and put the embodiment into brackets. So neuroscience as a deployment and extension of the Hegelian project and not its opposite. This may look really like an odd couple, extraordinary, surprising. One could say, with Faust, zwei Seelen wohnen ach in einer Brust. There are two souls in one breast. Are there two souls in your breast? I don't think so. No, I think there's just one entity which refuses to split to be divided into two separate entities. Because, well, refuses to be divided because it's itself nothing but division and connection at the same time. So we'll talk about artificial intelligence, which is a particularly thorny topic. And the slogan of this year's Indigo is "for real" with a question mark, implying that in our digital cyber world, in the utterly mediatized world, in this computational reality, perhaps nothing is for real. And that is very questionable what could be taken for real, the boundaries of our traditional reality seemingly dissolving. Along with the sharp dualities, the binary oppositions that seem to have endured for so long, like body, spirit, subject, object, intellect, machine, natural, symbolic. And there is also the slogan of plus, proposed by the French Institute, like more, with a question mark. And in French, there is the utter ambiguity, because plus can actually mean more or no more. Like plus d'argent can mean more money, a surplus of money, or a lack of money. There's no more money. So there is this ambiguity on this plus. And the artificial intelligence seems to embody these both slogans and sharply raises the question of for real with a question mark, presenting this point of the incredible. Can machines really do this? There are more and more wonders that they can do, emerging like every month. And I read a certain critique of the ChatGPT, which was written in December, maintaining that certain things, whatever, cannot be done by ChatGPT, but by the time when the paper was published in March, it could already do this. So, like the ChatGPT, all these capacities of quick development of artificial intelligence are like a step ahead of its critics. AI seems to be a dialectical entity par excellence, namely giving rise to two completely opposite reactions, giving rise to the hopes of resolving the great problems of humankind, the ultimate savior, whose intelligence vastly surpasses the human one, the redemption, promising to redeem us also from ourselves. Or, on the other hand, giving rise to the specter of the ultimate monster, the prospect of horror, the machines threatening to cause devastation of the human, taking control over the human, and running amok. And given their superior capacity, we can't be match for them. And indeed, this artificial intelligence presents a surplus of both hope and anxiety, a surplus of real magnificent capacities, and a surplus of a fantasy attached to them, all in one go. And it's like the ultimate achievement of the Enlightenment, both in its unimaginable capacities and in its destructive potential And the Enlightenment always comprised also the destructive potential. I would just recall that Frankenstein, written in 1818, was an arch fantasy of the Enlightenment, haunting it from the outset. That our products, the products of the most sophisticated advances in science, will get out of hand and turning into disaster. I guess we are not here to spread either the apocalyptic accounts and also not quite to promote the simply redemptive ones. And in biblical terms, neither the gospel nor the apocalypse. But rather to point out the ambiguity of this process and this predicament which is enacted in a spectacular way, which is perhaps a predicament as old as humanity. Throughout the history, every technological advance was invariably met with predictions of catastrophe. But there's this deeply ingrained technophobia, in particular in philosophy, but that needs to be reflected upon. Still, there is a wholly new dimension to this predicament, to this age-old predicament, this new blessing mixed with horror. And I guess we both agree in not sharing these narratives of salvation and doom, and that nevertheless agree that there is a dramatic shift that calls for concern, reflection. And I will take just a couple of cues from Catherine's remarkable book on the metamorphosis of intelligence. 2 cues. First, her claim in the book that artificial intelligence presents the fourth blow to human narcissism. And Freud, as you know, famously proposed 3 blows. First, with Copernicus, showing that we are not the center of the universe. Second, with Darwin, showing that we are the product of an evolution of animal kingdom, and thus diminishing, bridging the gap, the gulf between the animals and the human. And finally, Freud, placing himself in this lineage, showing that we are not even masters in our own house, given the unconscious forces that decenter our autonomous mind. And science, in this view, appears as the opposite of self-regard, of the fantasies of human grandeur and human specialty, human omnipotence. It presents a call for modesty. And there is a paradox, so we are demoted, our narcissism gets demoted as these blows progress. But the more science is demoted and demotes the man to this modest place, the more omnipotent he actually became with all the technological development and gadgets that science made possible. Now, Catherine proposes that AI presents a fourth blow by bridging the gap between men and machines. The machines demoting even further our elevated narcissism by their superior intelligence. And there is a kind of difference between the first 2 blows and the second 2. Namely, with the former 2, there is a dimension external to human, that is the agent of demotion, the new knowledge about the structure, the size of the universe, and the new knowledge about the development of the natural world of which we are the products. And with the latter 2, there is a different question of our own products getting the upper hand or getting out of hand, out of reach of our will. The unconscious is something that we unwittingly produce ourselves without intent, and yet it's beyond our conscious steering, undermining our autonomy. And then the AI, which is also our product, but our very conscious product, the product of our most concerted and sophisticated endeavor and intent. Yet something that threatens to demote us or humiliate us even more and run amok. So this man-made simulation of human intelligence may surpass the human intelligence itself. And, well, I will just mention one Freud's word. I mean, I like this word. He only uses this term once. And the term is Prothesengott. Prothesengott means a God with prosthesis, prosthetic God. He says man, with the science, with all these gadgets becoming omnipotent, omniscient, etc., he is godlike. But godlike only when his prostheses are at hand. And the prostheses elongate, prolong the body, extend the body, and artificial intelligence is the ultimate prolongation of human brain, just as the telescope or the microscope with the prolongation of human eyes. And I like this expression, prosthetic God, because we are gods only as long as we have the prosthesis. It's a divinity on crutches. But the human cannot be conceived without this prosthetic extension. So that there is like there's something non-human within the human artificial, which calls for an artificial extension from the outset, an inherent need for a prosthesis. There's no human nature without this prosthesis, and AI is the most formidable prosthesis, extended not only to the instrumental part of it, but to what makes us human in the first place, our intelligence, our creativity. And this brings me to the second cue I take from her book, namely the insistence on the intertwining of the natural and artificial, or more broadly of the biological and the symbolic, ultimately of nature and culture. And I quote, "There is only one life, il n'y a qu'une seule vie, there is but one life." This is a sentence which stands at the beginning and at the very end of the book as the sort of parting shot, the last sentence. And in the beginning she says, "There is only one life, the symbolic and the biological are originally and intimately mixed, mêlés, they're blended, joined, merged. The borderline between two is blurred or surpassed. The borderline between intelligence and intellect, between brain and intellect, between natural and artificial, between machine and intellect. And plasticity is now a way to conceive this blurred border, which used to sharply separate the two opposite domains, ultimately nature and culture, machine and spirit." And there is a subplot to her book, which her second book I'm speaking about, which continues the first book on the brain, which now the second book continues and overturns the previous book. And she clearly states, "I was wrong." And even at one point saying, "I was stupid," which is a very rare thing for an author to admit bluntly. And what was wrong with the conclusion of the first book? Namely, the idea of plasticity of the brain was seen as a new way to conceive a way to human liberty, not as opposed to our biological determination, but on the basis of it, of conceiving it precisely as plastic, and thus escaping this determinist causality. So the previous book conceived the brain as plastic with all these speculative possibilities, and the machine, on the other hand, as a domain of rigidity, quantification, and mechanism. So plasticity was reserved for the brain, and hence the privilege of the neuroscience, while the machine was seen as being on the other side. And now, a decade later, she presents this new view of overlapping the perspective of one life within which there is a dialectic of the symbolic and the biological, where the two sides cannot be simply collapsed, but neither can they be held apart as separate and as opposite entities. And there is the paradox of this emergence of entities like artificial life, the paradox of chips mimicking the brain, behaving just like synapses, and the paradox of plasticity being programmed, programming the non-programmable, as it were, and the paradox of plastic automat, the plastic machine. And I concur with this vision of the two entities which cannot be seen as separate. It's just a question of how do we conceive this unity? How do we conceive this one life? What is this one life? And I think psychoanalysis would largely concur with this, that symbolic and the natural, the somatic and the psychic, this would be Freudian vocabulary, are not two entities set apart. They are paradoxically connected, but connected through a move of negativity and antagonism. So what kind of unity are we talking about when we are talking about one life? What is the nature of one and this split? And I'm kind of, well, inclined to say one divides into two. But one divides into two is precisely the way of contradiction and holding together two entities in the contradiction itself, in the negativity, in the negative mood itself. And okay, I'm too long, but I would just mention two questions that I would like to raise in the end and leave them in suspense. And first would be the question of subjectivity. Is there a subject in all this? Where is a subject? A subject on the side of the brain, a subject on the side of artificial intelligence, on the side of symbolic, biologic, the interstice. And the question is raised in the book at one point where she says the superintelligence presents a prospect of being endowed with subjectivity. So the prospect is already open, that the machine itself would be endowed with subjectivity. But what exactly, what subjectivity we are speaking about? And the second question I would really end here would be the prospect, the perspective offered by this view of one life. And the book offers a number of formulas which may seem kind of optimistic or even utopian, or maybe wishful thinking. I quote, democratic construction of collective intelligence, participative technology. One would have to endeavor to construct a just and emancipatory political vision of a cybernetic togetherness, which would bring the relation between the two intelligences, the natural and the artificial one, to the highest degree of complicity. Furthermore, the prospect of experimental democracy, which is a term invented by Dewey, which today cannot be conceived outside of global self-management of knowledge, l'autogestion mondiale du savoir, a space that belongs to all. Intelligence has no being and cannot belong to anyone. It only exists in its metamorphosis. So we have to reinvent the confidence in intelligence, to have the faith in the power of intelligence. So these are the sort of positive formulas, the positive prospect that the book finally offers. And my question would be, in the face of all the calamities, imagined or real, the book ultimately proposes a sort of utopian vision of reconciliation or optimistic prospect. But aren't we faced with a unity of quite a different kind? Namely, not one life, but one capital. Like one capital. I mean, underlying the diversity, all the multiplicity of platforms of emerging new gadgets, etc., isn't there the threat to the unity of one life, which is the oneness of capital, which underlies this, which subtends the very development of artificial intelligence. And also, this is why the prospect of surveillance, control, etc., is in many respects very, very real, quite apart from technophobia and the general philosophical fear of the developments of technique. So, can we handle, how can we handle a delicate balance between the two? So this would be some reflections, some introductory remarks to placing your project, and some questions which I leave hanging in the air. So maybe we can come back to this after your talk. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this beautiful introduction and a very challenging one. I hope I will answer to these questions as I'm developing my own topic, because I became much less optimistic in time about all these questions. So first of all, again, thank you very much, Mladen, and I hope we can come back to the discussion afterward. I want to thank the Indigo Festival, the organizers, for inviting me, also the French Institute. So, as Mladen has just recalled, a few years ago I started a research on this concept of intelligence, because I had worked on the brain, as Mladen also recalled, and at some point, hearing all the time about artificial intelligence, I was curious to study the difference and perhaps the identity between brain and more precisely brain plasticity and intelligence. And once again, this study became a book in 2015 called Morphing Intelligence from IQ to IA. So at the time when I wrote the book, again, 2015, intelligence had accomplished only 3 of what I called its metamorphoses. That is, the transformations it had undergone over a century from the time of its birth as the prime object of experimental psychology in the 19th century, up to its most recent neurobiological and cybernetic developments. So, in order to respond to the challenge implied in the question for real that gathers us tonight, I would like today to develop what appears to me as a 4th metamorphosis, and the one I'm calling artificial anarchism. So before I develop this 4th metamorphosis, I have to briefly recapitulate the 3 first metamorphoses. So the first one, that I call genetic fate, happened with the passage from a very indeterminate notion of intelligence, used indistinctively as synonymous with spirit or the mind, to intelligence understood as a measurable entity that could be assessed with tests. So it started with Francis Galton's work and the creation of eugenics in the 19th century, and went on with the invention of tests like the metric scale of Binet and Simon, the French psychologist, up to the famous IQ. And this first metamorphosis gave way in the beginning of the 20th century to a genetic approach and the search for what at the time was called a possible intelligence gene. And this dream of a genetic discovery of intelligence ended with the sequencing of the human genome in 2003. And this gave way to the second metamorphosis, which coincided with the shift from a genetic to an epigenetic paradigm. So that's why the second metamorphosis I called the epigenetic metamorphosis of intelligence, that appeared in the early 21st century biology. This change allowed for a reconsideration of the idea of a blind genetic determinism of intelligence, and it opened the possibility of a new examination of the action of the environment on the constitution of the individual organism. And the discovery of brain plasticity was central to that moment. Scientists discovered that brain development was largely epigenetic, meaning that habit, experience, and education played a determining role in the formation of and life of neuronal connections. So it was the end of this conception of that intelligence might be innate. Intelligence is constructed. But the problem is that this epigenetic paradigm also affected artificial intelligence. Prominent researchers supported the hypothesis that natural intelligence and synaptic machines had the same structure. The idea of a machine that becomes a brain, a machine that is just as evolving and adaptive as a neuronal architecture, to the point of being able to simulate it perfectly and increase operating speed virtually to infinity, began to make complete sense. This was the moment when the famous book by Kurzweil, Singularity, came up. The manufacture of chips with plasticity, that is, chips able to transform themselves, was the equivalent achievement in the field of AI to the neurobiological epigenetic revolution of the 90s. The third metamorphosis was the age that started after this epigenetic term. It was the age when intelligence became automatic once and for all, as the result of a removal of the rigid frontiers between nature and the artifact. The power of automatism by far exceeds a simple robotization, and the increasingly refined simulation of natural intelligence allowed a new approach to the problem, allowing, as Mladen recalled, a complicity, a very strong intimacy between the biological and technological simulation. And at the time when I ended the book, I said this third metamorphosis, the age of automatism, total automatism of intelligence, is still in progress. But now we are at the heart of this age of automatism. It has come, we are in it, but the recent leap accomplished by AI is so phenomenal that I do think, once again, that intelligence has entered the age of a fourth metamorphosis. Simulation, the for real, is at stake in it. It was, of course, already at the center of the third metamorphosis, with artificial neural networks or intelligent robots. But the fourth metamorphosis, in which we are right now, is conferring simulation a new power, and it is the age of what I will call tentatively the age of anarchic replication. I hesitate between artificial anarchism and anarchic replication. And I will explain why this hesitation. Anarchic having to be taken here literally as without, in Greek, an arche, that is without a principle, without a commandment. The fourth metamorphosis is not only an age where artificial intelligence simulation is limitless, it is an age in which the disappearance of the model-copy dualism allows for the emergence of an absolute horizontality. The model has lost its superiority, and the copy becomes as important as the model, so the duality disappears. So this is this age of horizontality that is, of course, technological, but also, and this is perhaps the most important trait, political. That's why I allow myself to characterize this fourth metamorphosis of intelligence as the age of anarchy. At stake for me is whether we can envisage a possible transition from anarchic replication to anarchist replication, hence the hesitation on my title. What if the new metamorphosis of intelligence were not only the age of cyber capitalism or libertarianism, but also that of anarchism and of non-governability? But before I try to answer in the end to these massive questions, I have to develop a few reflections on this current state of this technological anarchy. We can consider that today the state has already disintegrated, offering nothing more than a protective envelope for the various oligarchies that have divided up the world between themselves. Everywhere, the social world is condemned here also to a horizontality of desertion. In economically privileged democratic countries, the effects of the already long-standing collapse of the welfare state continue to circulate indefinitely. No state institution, no common parliamentary organization can respond today to the challenges of poverty, ecological crisis, migrations, health problems, we remember the COVID, in any way other than through pitiful emergency measures. Technological power has clearly substituted for state power. So what we are witnessing today must be termed the anarchist turn in capitalism itself. This turn, born of the financial crisis of the 2000s, the years 2000, marked the shift from neoliberalism to what we can consider to be ultra-liberalism. The development of post-Fordist capitalism at the end of the 20th century was not yet fluent in the language that economic actors practice openly today, that is, the now hegemonic language of anarcho-capitalism, that is, cyber-capitalism, or else the capitalism of the platforms. So this anarchic replication age in which we are is the age of the triumph of cyber-capitalism. So I hear the objection. Are we not witnessing the global hardening of political interventionism that is inseparable from a new form of centralizing economic power? How can I speak of anarchy at a moment when we are facing an intensified political authoritarianism, the confiscating of wealth and profit by a handful of companies and conglomerates? Yes, it is true. We certainly are, and we know that artificial intelligence is in the hands of very few people. And yet, when political commentators declare in all seriousness that Donald Trump is an anarchist, was the title of an article published in the New Yorker. So when they declare that Donald Trump is an anarchist, they are not using the word lightly. They are trying to articulate what the entire world is experiencing as a major crisis. The hybrid combination of government violence, it is true, but also the unending Uberization of life. Authoritarianism does not oppose the disappearance of the state. It is rather its messenger. The more the state is disappearing, the more authoritarian it gets. This paradox masks this so-called collaborative economy that every day erodes still further any fixed regulations by putting professionals and users in direct contact through technological platforms. Our entire lives now are played in this game, in these platform games. So how then can we separate the horizontality of these technological platforms from the horizontality of some political alternative manifestations like those of the Yellow Vest in France, for example, that refuse any control by parties or unions? How can we separate or relate the horizontality of cyber anarchism and the horizontality of maybe a new form of revolutionary anarchism? How do we dig for the relief of a difference at the surface? Such is, in my view, the new geographical, political, and philosophical challenge of the 21st century. And to answer Mladen when he asked me, is there only one capital? The question is very difficult because there is one form today, which is horizontality. And in this unique form, there are two branches. One is strictly capitalist, and the other is emancipatory. It's two forms of anarchism that are fighting each other, but at the same time, and still unable to articulate their difference, to elaborate on their difference. So we are currently living in a time of deep anarchist ambiguity. And of course, the development of AI is actively participating in this undecidability. Let me take 3 examples. First, the world of the blockchain, cryptocurrency transactions, and the circulation of non-national currencies, on which I made some research a few years ago. It is true that I was at first fascinated by the promise this currency represented, because they leech off state currencies and compete in the usual circulation of funds by commercial and central banks. I thought this is wonderful if we could avoid going through banks. It looked like an emancipatory promise. Wasn't this announcing the end of a certain epoch of governmentality, centralization, and hierarchy? But it did not take long for me to understand that in reality, these new systems were strengthening control, inequalities, and oligarchic trends. So here also you see ambiguity between emancipation and control. The second example is Taiwan, where there are now anarchists holding governmental positions, officially holding governmental positions. Such is the case of Audrey Tang. Audrey Tang is the Minister of Digital Affairs in Taiwan, the first transgender prime minister in history, a genius cybernetician and free software creator. Audrey Tang defines themselves openly as a conservative anarchist. They have identified as post-gender and accepted whatever pronoun people want to describe me with online. The pleonasm of conservative anarchist should not be misconstrued. What Tang means is that they want to work on the conservation of the anarchist utopia experimented by the internet programmers who, over the past 20 years, have been suggesting that a virtual participative democracy be substituted for classical political decision-making. It is true that at the time when I wrote Metamorphoses of Intelligence, I believed in this utopia of this collective participative democracy, this technological democracy. And clearly Tang is saying that it is happening, but here also it's very ambiguous. So on the one hand, the strategy in Taiwan consists in using open source coding tools to radically redesign and rebuild an existing government process of service. Citizens can enter all the governmental platforms and say what they think and propose solutions. So there's a kind of dialogue between the government and the citizens through the platforms. In a text called Hack the Pandemic, and we know that in Taiwan, the pandemic was practically inoffensive thanks to these dialogues. So in Hack the Pandemic, Tang declares, I quote, "Simply by changing the O to a 0 in your browser bar, you enter a parallel government site that may be working better, where there are viable alternatives." There are currently approximately 9,000 citizens participating in what we call bifurcating the government. In open source culture, bifurcating means taking something that is already there and taking it in a different directions. Citizens accept digital surveillance, but the state also accepts transparency and openness of its data and its codes, and it integrates the criticism that will necessarily emerge. So it's a kind of exchange, once again, between state surveillance and freedom of the citizens. But we see, of course, the ambiguity, because the state doesn't disappear. And we might wonder if Audrey Tang is a symptom of domination or emancipation. And I mean, they are both, clearly. Many critics have said that Audrey Tang is still, they still incarnate domination, commandments. Tech governance in Taiwan is said to be very much alike that of the West. And at the same time, clearly, there's a revolution happening there. And my third example of ambiguity is very short. It's Elon Musk, who recently declared, "If you must know, I am a utopian anarchist." And I think this is very interesting. You understand why? Because these three phenomena, the blockchain, Tang, and Elon Musk, are, of course, representing different forms of this horizontality that is so problematic. Let's try to go further in the analysis of those ambiguities, focusing on the sudden appearance of ChatGPT in our lives. While trying to understand what exactly ChatGPT was doing, I recently went back to the French sociologist Jean Baudrillard and the reflections on simulacra that he has developed all his life. Baudrillard is forgotten today, and this is it's a bad thing because I think he understood very clearly what a simulacrum was. And I went back to his book called Symbolic Exchange and Death, in which he argues that there are 3 orders of simulacra. So, very briefly, in the first order of, and these orders of simulacra coincide more or less with the 3 first metamorphoses of intelligence. In the first order of simulacra, which he associates with the pre-modern period, the image is a clear copy of the real. The simulated is a copy of, the simulating is a clear copy of the simulated. And the image is recognized as just an illusion. It's the age of what he calls the counterfeit. In the second order of simulacra, which he associates with the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, the distinctions between the image and the representation begin to break down because of mass production and the proliferation of copies. He says it's the age of equivalences. Photography, cinema are so perfect imitations that we don't see the difference between the model and the copies. It's the age of equivalences. And in the third order of simulacra that he associated with the postmodern age, he says we are confronted with a precession of simulacra, that is that the representation or the imitation precedes and determines the real. There is no longer any distinction between reality and its representation. There is only the simulacrum. It is, he says, the age of robotics. So, of course, Baudrillard could not anticipate on the fourth metamorphosis of intelligence. He could not anticipate the happening of ChatGPT, but I think that his approach is very helpful. I think particularly of his claim that the transformations of simulacra he's analyzing always go with different representations and uses of language. The first age of the simulacrum coincides with the reign of the signified. The copy is a signifier that relates to a signified. It is the age of what he called the strong symbolic order. In the second age, the signifieds have disappeared, opening to a general economy of interchangeable signifiers. In the age of robotics, Baudrillard says it is the age of the simulacrum of a lost symbolic relation. So it's the loss of any kind of referentiality. We talk, we act without any reference to any kind of outside external reference. So clearly, I find that very interesting because clearly in the age of anarchist replication, a new semantic system is emerging. I mean, a new regime of sense, which with ChatGPT clearly substitutes the question-answer couple to that of the signifier-signified one, and this on a horizontal plane. ChatGPT functions as a mirror, and it functions in the absence of all forms, once again, of referentiality. Ask me about what you intend to mean, and I will answer. I will provide you with the meaning of what you mean, because in fact, ChatGPT only answers to the questions we are asking it. So the asking structure is more important than what is asked. We don't care that much about sense, about signified, signifiers, the machine says. We play master and servant. Ask me, I will serve you, respond to you, while we both know that there is no master at work here, that our relationship is perfectly horizontal, as my answers are just the pure reflections of your queries and demands. ChatGPT can only tell us what we already know. It is in that sense that the question-answer system is a new structure that can be seen as a form of anarchic mode of organization, anarchic meaning, once again, without a principle in which the production of meaning is built out of just the exchange of language with itself. So there's nothing outside language, it's just language in conversation with itself through a technological medium. Nevertheless, it seems that an anarchic replication of the lost symbolic relation tends to subreptitiously restore it at the moment when it shows it is lost, while an anarchist replication would be a process of acceptance of the loss. If you have noticed that many people say, oh, but this machine, in a certain sense, have no importance. They cannot replace the human. They cannot replace the human because the human remains the reference. Many people want to restore the model-copy duality, while it is clear that it has disappeared. Everybody knows Noam Chomsky, and unfortunately, Chomsky fell recently to that trap that consists in saying, oh, but we still have models, we still have reference, and the reference are our own human intelligence. He recently wrote a text that totally downplays the role and importance of ChatGPT. And the text that was published in last March, is called The False Promise of ChatGPT, also published in the New Yorker. Chomsky's contempt for ChatGPT is not that surprising when we realize, as another linguist recently declared, so here is what ChatGPT has done. It has falsified, in the starkest terms, Chomsky's claim that innate principles of language are necessary to learn a language. ChatGPT has shown that without any hardwired principles of grammar or language, this program, coupled with massive data, can learn a language. So what is important is that Chomsky has a vision of language as a genetic process. We first need to speak slowly, and then a child develops several skills. The process of acquiring language is genetic. ChatGPT has made that explode totally because ChatGPT learns out of data. It learns all at once without any principles. It collects data and learns without any forms of genesis. So many texts similar to that of Chomsky recently appeared here and there, but they don't understand that their visions of language, their visions of human intelligence, their visions of the construction of culture are totally obsolete now because machines or processes like ChatGPT erase the verticality of learning. They put everything on the same plane, on the same ground, and that's why, once again, any difference between the reference and the copy disappears. So how can we respond, so to speak, to that challenge of horizontality? Of course, the development of these processes do not erase our responsibility. So we have to respond to the response, because responsibility is at stake. Response is the question, but responding to these processes once again, doesn't mean that we have to establish a hierarchy between the superiority of the human and the secondarity of the machine. This is not the right way to go, in my opinion. In fact, before coming in conclusion to this decisive issue of responsibility, let me mention an interesting ChatGPT exchange published on the Anarchist Studies blog. I went to this blog because I wanted to know what ChatGPT had to say about anarchism. So the prompt was, write an introduction for an article about AI, dialogue, and anarchism. And the responses were very disappointing. So for example, what would Peter Kropotkin say about AI dialogue? And Kropotkin, I read ChatGPT, would likely approach the topic of AI dialogue with a nuanced perspective, considering both its potential benefits and drawbacks. Write a short speech in the style of Emma Goldman about AI dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with a heavy heart that I stand before you today to address the issue of AI dialogue and its impact on our struggle for a free and equitable society. And once again, it's just, let's measure the pros and cons. What are the advantages? What are the drawbacks? Same thing for Max Stirner, writes a series of aphorisms in the style of Max Stirner. AI dialogue is but a tool, a means to an end, not an end in itself, etc., etc. So I'm sure you all have played with ChatGPT's responses and have noticed that globally, the responses are shallow and disappointing. Sometimes it's striking because we have the illusion that it is that the responses are very strong, but it doesn't take long to notice that they are very insufficient. And when our students use ChatGPT, it's immediately visible, etc., etc. So I will conclude this talk with my question of responsibility. If we try to push the interpretation a bit further, we understand that ChatGPT, in fact, responds to many things, but it does not respond of itself. It can, of course, say what it is made for, but it cannot respond of itself, for itself. It is not responsible of itself. The absence of response here is not the absence of a determinate, particular answer concerning this or that point. Beyond the absence of a particular response, what manifests itself in artificial intelligence in general is an irreducible responselessness, answerlessness. Artificial intelligence is responseless because it cannot respond of itself, which means that, going back to the symbolic, we can consider that the place of response is in reality empty. The place of response does not respond of itself. In its absolute non-response, the chatbot appears in its utmost anarchist being, which is non-commandment, the place of the non-governable. There is, and will always be, a dimension of responselessness behind all the responses of the speaking machine. We cannot hold it accountable for this responselessness because this space of non-response leaves us alone and therefore, contrarily to what Chomsky affirms, infinitely responsible. This space of non-response in which we are, which coincides with the age of anarchic replication, once again, is not the mark of a defect or of an insufficiency. It is the place of the nothing to say. Artificial intelligence has nothing to say. It just says what we already know, what we want it to say. Such a place is not the place of the signified, once again, is not the place of the Lacanian symbolic. It is not the place of the blank square, of the floating signifier, because it is not even empty. It is the time of anarchic replication. We are witnessing constant attempts at filling this place up with new modes of control, and the promise that one day ChatGPT or more sophisticated systems will respond to everything, thus restoring the lost symbolic relationship. But no, AI won't ever respond to everything, because absolute responselessness is irredeemable, and it's the very condition for the existence of intelligence. If we could respond to everything, we wouldn't be intelligent. Anarchic replication cannot occult its best enemy, which is the anarchist replication. Artificial responseless intelligence lets natural intelligence the task of inventing the responsibility for the non-response. And this is what maybe anarchism is precisely: order minus power, the task of inventing ways of life and modes of political organizations out of the absolute responselessness of life and of technology. In the age of the fourth metamorphosis of intelligence, we know that there is absolutely nothing more to await from on high, and that's for real. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That was great. We actually haven't got much time. I would just make maybe a comment that I'm very glad that you brought in the question of the new advances of capitalism and the new dangers of control and surveillance, etc., etc. What you spoke about in the first part, the disappearance of the state coinciding with authoritarianism. Because what I frankly missed in your book on the metamorphosis of intelligence is precisely this aspect. I mean, the whole capitalist setting within which this happens. Because the book somehow deals directly with the question of the biological versus the artificial and the prejudices this raises and the sort of philosophical ways of escaping the thing, the technophobic prejudices which prevent us to think about artificial in new ways. And precisely the very format within which this happens, which is the format of modern capitalism. And it's only within this format that we have our artificial intelligence, which indeed transforms into this anarchic new form of capitalism, but the seeming anarchy which actually reinforces domination. The more it's anarchic, the more there is domination. And well, my question, my comment would be perhaps anarchism. You use this term as a completely ambivalent term, like it can have this meaning of actually reinforcing domination, but it has an emancipatory potential. And I would just say simply, is it a pharmacon? I mean, you know, Derrida make this big case of pharmacon being the poison and the cure. Is it to be thought along these lines? Because it was very central to his take on.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, it's true that at the time when I wrote Morphing Intelligence, I was not yet, I don't know if I'm able today, but at the time I was not able to really put this development of intelligence in relation with the development of capitalism, because I hadn't understood the direction it was in which it was going, like this anarchic platform structures. So clearly, I think there is an emancipatory, I still think that this is perhaps my optimism, that there is an emancipatory potential at the same time in this anarchist turn of capitalism because of this horizontality that we have to appropriate. And the example of tongue is interesting because it is true that at the origin of the internet, we find anarchists, people who believe very strongly that the internet would allow us to be in contact with each other without any forms of centralized power, etc. So in artificial intelligence, there is a true emancipatory potential, and it is a political potential that is precisely this power of anarchism, the capacity to organize ourselves without commandment. So is artificial intelligence a pharmacon that is just, in a certain sense, a prosthesis or both a gift, a poison and a cure? I think it's more than that, perhaps. I think what it reveals, as I clumsily try to say, is the essence of language. I do believe that, in fact, those machines are revealing the fundamental nature of language, which is that language can only speak to itself. The goal of language is to get into dialogue with itself without any reference to something external. So it's the very structure of language that is at stake, that has been approached so many times. It's true by Hegel, by Derrida. They all tried to say that there was nothing outside language, but I think that we are touching this reality in a very, very material way today, that language is the real, with no externality. And artificial intelligence is revealing that. And at the same time, this does not annul our responsibility, because we are speaking subject, and your question was, what is subjectivity? Precisely, perhaps, as speaking subject, we have to respond for this autonomy of language, because paradoxically, language gets into dialogue with itself, but it cannot respond of itself. It is our responsibility to take care of this internal dialogue and to engage it in a direction that is not this capitalistic exploitation of sense. It is our responsibility to transform, to engage this self-dialogue of language into poetic dimensions, creative dimensions. I don't believe that AI is threatening human creativity. It is our responsibility to know how to find ways to develop these creative potentials out of this absence of referentiality. And if there's a human subject, maybe that would be this one, the responsible subject for the responselessness of language.
So the subject stepping into the lack of response, the responselessness of language, the empty spot, as it were, of the lack of the response, this is precisely the spot that the subject should occupy in order to take responsibility. Is this your
I think we are
line?
here because there's no response. Finitude means that there's no response. That among the multitude of responses that we get every day, there is a fundamental silence. Yes, there's a fundamental absence of response, which is our condition. And in fact, artificial intelligence is not contradicting that. On the contrary, it radicalizes it, in my view.
All right, it's great.
I don't know at what time we have to stop.
We have to stop actually very, very shortly, I believe. So, I don't know, this is maybe the time that we can open the floor to the questions, just to take a couple of questions. Just, we are
sorry, maybe
short,
we were too
short
long.
for time, yeah.
Hello, First, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I have one very concrete question and then some thoughts. My question for you would be, were you experimenting using ChatGPT version 3 or version 4? Because it might be a bit funny, but from what I heard, version 4 is much more capable in also being creative, etc. And another thing that I find really interesting is how differently philosophers and perhaps people who are more in contact with and working in the field of humanities are looking at artificial intelligence in comparison with people who are with the engineers, with people working in the digital environment. I myself, I work in digital marketing, and I think it is really interesting where at my job, we are actually also, of course, discussing all of these topics, however, from a very different point of view. So the engineers and in business people, let's say, they are very excited over the capabilities of AI and ChatGPT in concrete. However, I myself, I'm much more inclined towards humanities and philosophical versions, and I'm much more, careful about it. I think what is really interesting is what artificial intelligence is. The question it is opening is this question of utilitarianism. Sorry, I'm slightly nervous. In terms that, in the end, what is important is the end product and not so much the way, so the skill that the human gains by performing a certain task over and over again. So in ChatGPT, you just say, okay, write me an article about this in the style of this, and you get the end result, the end product. However, the mere process of learning is not important anymore. So I think this is what is the danger, I guess, of the artificial intelligence. And what I think is one of the major topics that I think we're not discussing too much about it is the legal part of usage of the artificial intelligence, because, it is learning on our work, on the works of human, and then selling it to us again. But the profit is, in the case of ChatGPT, goes to Microsoft nowadays. So I think this is one of the issues that we will have to resolve in terms of AI use. Thank you.
Well, I think we totally agree. Thank you for your remarks. I take them as remarks more than questions because, it is in the hands of very few people. And it is true. I totally agree that people working in the industry of artificial intelligence and philosophers do not share at all the same vision of it. And it's true that most of my colleagues, philosophers, see artificial intelligence as evil. And this is the discourse we hear all the time. And I'm trying to develop maybe another approach because I don't see where this evil discourse can lead. I don't see the use of it. So thank you for your remarks.
And the last question.
Hi there. I wanted to thank you a lot for your incredible discussion, and also I think the introduction of Baudrillard into the conversation was absolutely crucial. I think the insights about the orders of simulacra absolutely do mirror what you've described in terms of metamorphoses. The question I had concretely was if you were aware of the phenomenon of so-called AI cannibalism, right? Cannibalism. So you were talking at length about this language responding to itself, right? But kind of fundamentally lacking, there being a sort of ultimate silence there. There is a structural concern in the field of artificial intelligence development of the database, the data on which the AI draws, being contaminated by stuff that has already been produced by AI. In that sense, recycling outputs. And this is why ChatGPT is heavily restricted to data before its inception, because if it were feeding on data after its inception, it would be cannibalizing its own data, and in this sense, the results of this are actually quite concerning because they produce very nonsensical things. So I suppose my question doesn't make sense now because I've decided to explain the phenomenon.
I'm not sure I have understood everything, but that was a very interesting word, which was recycling. Thank you for that, because this is exactly what I meant, that in fact artificial intelligence for its most part is a recycling of existing, well, data, because this is how it functions. That's why the idea of language in dialogue with itself is precisely this idea of language recycling itself. I mean, recycling is what puts an end to the model-copy duality. So, yes, I think the recycling is very important. Yeah, the recycling process. So I don't know if that was your question, but thank you for insisting on that term.
Thank you very much.
I see the signs that we must end. We are already over our time. So, Catherine, thank you so much. Thank you so much.